My name is Denise Whitmore. I'm 41 years old, and for the last 3 years I've run a small, fully licensed custom furniture business out of my garage. On a Thursday afternoon this spring, my neighbor called the non-emergency police line and reported me for running an illegal operation, hoping, I think, that a squad car in my driveway would finally embarrass me into shutting it down. What he didn't know, what none of us knew until the officer actually stepped out of his cruiser, was that the man walking up my driveway to investigate me had spent every Saturday morning that spring standing on the sideline of a youth soccer field, watching his own son play for a team I've coached for 6 years. Her silent revenge stories. If a neighbor has ever tried to use an institution against you, hoping nobody would look closely enough to see the truth, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. I built furniture as a hobby since I was in my 20s, taught by my grandfather in his own garage on weekends, back when I thought of it as nothing more than a way to spend time with him. After my divorce 5 years ago, needing both a creative outlet and a way to supplement my income as a part-time bookkeeper, I started building small pieces, cutting boards, side tables, the occasional bookshelf, and selling them through a local online marketplace. What started as a handful of sales a month slowly grew into something more substantial. Within 2 years, I was building custom dining tables and built-in shelving for clients across 3 counties, working almost entirely out of the detached 2-car garage behind my house, which I'd converted, at real expense, into a proper small workshop, dust collection system, a dedicated 220-volt circuit for my table saw, proper ventilation, the works. I want to be specific about the legal side of this, because it matters enormously for what happened later. Before I ever took on a single paying client, I went to my city's planning department and applied for a home occupation permit, the specific license required by my municipality for exactly this kind of small business run out of a residential property. I paid the fee, submitted floor plans of my workshop, agreed to the noise and hours restrictions the permit required, and was approved within 6 weeks. I renewed that permit every year without fail, and I kept a physical copy, laminated, in a folder just inside my garage door, specifically because I'd learned early on that a home-based business sometimes invites exactly the kind of scrutiny I eventually received. I want to describe, too, exactly what the permit itself restricted, because those specific terms mattered enormously later. My city's home occupation ordinance limited power tool operation to between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening on weekdays, and 10 to 4 on Saturdays, with no operation at all permitted on Sundays. It allowed up to 1 non-resident employee or contractor on site at a time, capped client visits to no more than 4 per week by appointment, and required, if I ever wanted to expand beyond those limits, a formal application for a conditional use permit rather than the simpler home occupation license I held. I'd read that ordinance closely enough, in the early days of the business, that I could essentially recite it from memory, a level of familiarity that would end up serving me very well. I also invested, in that first year, in sound dampening insulation for the garage walls and a secondary door specifically designed to reduce noise transmission to the property line, upgrades that cost more than I was entirely comfortable spending at the time, but that I now consider some of the smartest money I've ever put into the business, given everything that followed. Gerald Hobbs moved into the house next door to mine about 2 years ago, a retired claims adjuster in his early 60s who, from almost the beginning, made clear he had strong opinions about how a residential street ought to look and sound. Our first real conflict happened within a month of his moving in, over a shared property line and a fence he believed, incorrectly according to the survey I eventually had to pay for, extended 6 inches onto his side of the lot. That fence dispute resolved itself, eventually, once the survey came back conclusively in my favor, but I don't think Gerald ever fully let go of the sense of grievance it left behind. Over the following 2 years, he found other things to object to, the specific pitch of my table saw, which he insisted ran outside the permitted hours even though I kept a log proving otherwise, the number of client vehicles that occasionally parked on the street in front of my house, a smell he once described to another neighbor as chemical, despite the fact that I use only low VOC, water-based finishes specifically because of the questions I'd anticipated fielding. I tried, more than once, to have an actual conversation with Gerald about his concerns, hoping we could work out something reasonable between neighbors rather than escalating things unnecessarily. Those conversations rarely went well. Gerald had a specific way of speaking to me, clipped, faintly condescending, the tone of someone who'd already decided the conversation's outcome before it started, that made genuine compromise feel, every time, slightly out of reach. One exchange in particular stayed with me. About a year into his tenancy next door, I'd invited him over, somewhat optimistically, to actually see the workshop itself, hoping that putting a face and a physical space to the noise he heard through the fence might soften his view of things. He walked through, looked at the dust collection system, the sound insulation, the permit and inspection records I'd laid out on my workbench, and said, essentially, that it was a nice setup for a hobby, a phrase that told me, more clearly than almost anything else he could have said, that he'd already decided, on some level, that my livelihood didn't fully count as a real business deserving the same consideration he'd extend to, say, a neighbor who commuted to an office downtown. Tension with Gerald had been building for a specific reason in the weeks leading up to what happened. I'd taken on my largest commission yet that spring, a full custom kitchen renovation's worth of built-in cabinetry for a family 2 towns over, a project substantial enough that I'd needed to bring in a part-time assistant, a young woodworker named Theo, for about 6 weeks to help meet the deadline. That meant, for those 6 weeks, slightly more activity around my property than usual, Theo's truck parked on the street a few mornings a week, a slightly longer stretch of daytime saw use as we worked to finish the project on schedule, deliveries of lumber and hardware arriving more frequently than my typical month. All of it stayed within the bounds of my permit. I was careful about that, having learned by then exactly how closely Gerald seemed to be watching, but the increased volume of ordinary activity was, I think, the tipping point for him. He mentioned it to me directly once, standing at the property line while I was unloading a delivery of plywood. "This is getting to be a lot," he said. "I don't remember your permit saying anything about employees." I told him, accurately, that Theo was a part-time independent contractor, not an employee, and that my permit covered exactly this kind of arrangement. Gerald didn't respond to that directly. He simply looked at the stack of plywood for a long moment and walked back inside. On a Thursday afternoon in April, while Theo and I were finishing up a run of cabinet doors, a police cruiser pulled slowly into my driveway. I remember the specific jolt of anxiety that comes from seeing a patrol car arrive unannounced at your own home, even when you're fairly confident, as I was, that you haven't done anything wrong, a jolt that doesn't fully go away just because your rational mind knows your paperwork is in order. The officer who stepped out, a man I'd later learn was named Officer Ray Delgado, approached with the calm, procedural demeanor I imagine officers cultivate specifically for exactly these kinds of low-stakes civilian disputes. He explained that his department had received a call, a neighbor reporting a possible unpermitted business operation at this address, citing frequent vehicle traffic, non-resident workers, and extended hours of what the caller described as industrial noise. I want to describe the specific, sinking feeling of hearing that summary, because even with a fully valid permit sitting in a folder 20 feet away, there's something inherently destabilizing about a uniformed officer standing in your driveway describing your legitimate small business back to you in language clearly designed to sound alarming. Theo, standing nearby, went quiet and visibly nervous in a way I recognized, having once been a 24-year-old worried about accidentally becoming a story his own family would hear about secondhand. I remember, in those first few seconds, running through a quick, anxious mental inventory. Had I miscounted Theo's hours somewhere? Had a client visit that week technically exceeded the weekly cap? Had I misremembered some detail of the ordinance I thought I knew by heart? None of those worries turned out to be founded, but I want to be honest that even a person confident in their own paperwork can feel, in that specific moment, a flicker of doubt entirely disproportionate to the actual facts. There's a particular vulnerability that comes with having built something significant out of your own home, a space that's simultaneously your business and the place you live, and having a stranger with real institutional authority standing in the middle of it, deciding, at least in that moment, how the story gets told. I told Officer Delgado I had documentation, invited him to step just inside the garage, which he did, professionally, glancing around at the workshop with the kind of neutral, observant expression I imagine officers are trained to maintain regardless of what they actually think about a situation, and retrieved the laminated folder I'd kept for exactly this purpose. I walked him through it methodically, the home occupation permit itself, issued by the city and renewed annually, the specific hours restriction I operated well within, the noise ordinance limits my equipment was tested against when I first applied, and a log I'd kept, somewhat obsessively, of Theo's hours and vehicle presence, specifically because Gerald's previous complaints had taught me to document everything. I also showed him the sound insulation installed along the shared property line wall, the aftermarket muffling housing I'd had custom fitted to my table saw's motor 2 years earlier specifically in response to an earlier round of complaints, and the receipts confirming when each upgrade had been completed. I wanted him to see, plainly, that the picture painted by the phone call, an operation expanding carelessly, indifferent to its neighbors, was close to the opposite of how I'd actually approached the business from the very beginning. Officer Delgado reviewed the paperwork carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, how long I'd held the permit, whether the noise ordinance testing had been done recently, whether Theo was aware of and compliant with the permit's terms regarding non-resident workers, all of which I answered clearly, with documentation to back up each point. I could see, watching his expression shift slightly as the picture became clear, that whatever alarming account he'd been given over the phone was starting to look considerably less alarming in person. It was while reviewing the permit itself, which lists my full legal name, that Officer Delgado paused, looked up at me properly for the first time since introducing himself, and asked, in a noticeably different tone than the procedural one he'd been using, "Wait, are you Coach Denise? From the Falcons?" I told him yes, a little startled by the sudden shift, and he broke into what I can only describe as genuine, surprised recognition. "My son's on that team," he said. "Marcus Delgado. Number 14. You coached him last fall and you're coaching him again this spring." I placed him almost immediately once he said his son's name, a quiet, reliably early-arriving dad who stood near the far corner of the field most Saturdays, someone I'd exchanged brief, friendly small talk with dozens of times over the past 2 seasons without ever knowing his profession, since most of my interactions with soccer parents happen entirely within the specific, narrow context of practices and games. "I had no idea that was you," he said, glancing down at the permit again, then back up at me. "I've been standing on that sideline every Saturday for 2 seasons. Marcus talks about your practices constantly." There was a specific, visible recalibration happening in his expression, the look of someone quickly reconciling 2 previously separate mental categories, the stranger described in a phone complaint, and the person his own son had been talking about at the dinner table for 2 years. I want to explain, briefly, why coaching that team has meant as much to me as it has, because I think it matters for understanding why that moment of recognition landed the way it did. I started coaching the Falcons 6 years ago, not long after my divorce, at a point in my life when I badly needed something structured and outward-facing to hold on to. My own son had aged out of the youth league 2 years earlier, but I'd stayed on as a volunteer coach anyway, partly because I'd grown genuinely attached to the specific, unglamorous work of teaching 8- and 9-year-olds the fundamentals of a game, and partly because it gave me a consistent, weekly anchor during a period when very little else in my life felt consistent. Marcus Delgado, it turned out, had joined the team the same season I'd started noticing Gerald's complaints intensify, a coincidence of timing I hadn't thought about until that exact moment in my driveway, watching his father put together, piece by piece, exactly who I was outside the context of a phone complaint. Officer Delgado's demeanor, already professional and fair before that moment, became noticeably warmer once the recognition landed, though I want to be clear that he didn't abandon procedure. He still reviewed my documentation fully, still asked Theo a few brief questions to confirm his account matched mine, still did, as far as I could tell, everything by the book. What changed was something harder to name precisely, a shift from cautious neutrality to something closer to open goodwill, the specific quality that exists between 2 people who suddenly realize they already trust each other from an entirely different context. "For what it's worth," he said, once he'd finished reviewing everything, "this all looks completely in order. Valid permit, documented hours, everything within the noise ordinance. I don't see anything here that constitutes a violation of anything." He paused, then added, in a slightly different, more personal register, "I coach youth football on the weekends. I'm not at Marcus's games, so I get how much work goes into building something like this on top of everything else. "This is a genuinely nice setup you built back here." I thanked him and asked, somewhat hesitantly, what would happen next, whether this would result in some kind of formal record, whether Gerald's complaint would trigger any further action. Officer Delgado explained that he'd file a standard report noting the call was unfounded, that no violation had been found, and that the property was in full compliance with its permit. What Officer Delgado mentioned next, somewhat in passing as he was wrapping up his notes, was a detail that ended up mattering more than either of us realized in that moment. He mentioned, casually, that this wasn't actually the department's first call regarding my address, or, as it turned out, regarding several addresses on my street. "I recognized the address before I even recognized you," he said. "We've had a few calls from this block over the past couple years, noise complaints, parking complaints, a couple of things that turned out to be nothing much once someone actually came out to look. I don't want to speculate about who's calling, since that's not really my place, but I'll say the pattern's been noted internally." I didn't press him further in the moment, partly out of genuine surprise, and partly because I didn't want to put him in the position of speculating openly about a specific neighbor. But the detail stayed with me, the idea that Gerald's complaint about me might not have been an isolated incident, but one entry in a longer, quieter pattern that the department itself had already started to notice, independent of anything I'd said or done. I want to be honest about the specific mixture of feelings I had, standing in my own driveway after Officer Delgado's cruiser pulled away, Theo still visibly rattled beside me, my laminated permit folder back in its place just inside the garage door. There was relief, obviously, the straightforward, physical relief of watching a genuine threat to something I'd built carefully over 3 years simply dissolve once the facts were actually examined. But underneath that relief was something less comfortable, a specific, slow-burning anger that took a little longer to fully surface. It wasn't really about the visit itself, which had, in the end, cost me nothing beyond an unsettling hour. It was about the fact that Gerald had picked up a phone specifically hoping that the mere presence of a police cruiser in my driveway, regardless of the actual facts underneath it, would do damage on its own. He hadn't wanted a fair investigation. He'd wanted the appearance of trouble, the kind of thing a neighbor might notice from across the street and quietly gossip about for weeks, true or not. Theo, once the cruiser was gone, asked me quietly whether this happened often, whether I was worried about it happening again. I told him the honest truth, which was that I didn't fully know, but that for the first time in 2 years of dealing with Gerald's complaints, I finally had something concrete, a documented, unfounded report, filed officially, with an officer's own notes attached. In the days that followed, Gerald made no direct mention of the visit, though I noticed, distinctly, that he'd stopped making the small, pointed comments he usually offered whenever our paths crossed near the property line. I don't know exactly what, if anything, he learned about how the visit had actually concluded, whether Officer Delgado's report reached him in any form, whether he simply noticed the absence of any consequence and drew his own conclusions, or whether some other neighbor mentioned, second-hand, that the police thing had apparently amounted to nothing. What I did notice, about a week later, was a car I didn't recognize in Gerald's driveway for the better part of an afternoon, a city vehicle, as it turned out, when I looked more closely at the seal on the door. I didn't think much of it at the time, beyond a passing curiosity, until a conversation with another neighbor, Priya, a few days after that, filled in what had actually happened. Priya, who lives 2 houses down and has lived on the street considerably longer than either Gerald or I have, stopped me during a walk to mention, somewhat conspiratorially, that she'd heard from another neighbor that Gerald had received a visit from the city's code enforcement office, not regarding me, but regarding his own property, following what she understood to be a routine review triggered, in part, by the volume of complaint calls originating from his address over the past 2 years. Apparently, Priya said, when the department gets that many calls from one address about different neighbors, it eventually flags for some kind of internal review, especially once a couple of them turn out to be unfounded. I don't know the specifics, but I guess someone from the city actually came out to look at his own property, and it turns out his detached shed has some kind of unpermitted electrical work he did himself a few years back. Nothing dangerous, apparently, but definitely not up to code, and definitely something he'd been trying to avoid anyone official ever looking at closely. Priya went on to mention that Gerald wasn't the only source of tension on the block either, that she herself had fielded a complaint from him the previous summer about her own above-ground pool, a complaint that had similarly gone nowhere once the city actually looked into it. Hearing this, I realized the pattern I'd assumed was specific to me had, in fact, touched at least 2 other households on the street, each of us privately assuming, until that conversation, that we'd simply been the unlucky, singular target of a difficult neighbor's attention. I want to be honest that I felt a complicated mixture of things hearing this, a flicker of something close to vindication, tangled with a genuine, and somewhat surprising, flicker of sympathy. I hadn't wanted this outcome, specifically. I hadn't orchestrated it, hadn't even known it was a possibility until Priya described it to me secondhand. It was simply what happened when a pattern of complaints, examined closely enough by people with the authority to actually look, eventually turned its scrutiny back toward the person who'd been generating it. About 2 weeks after the original visit, Gerald and I ended up at our mailboxes at the same time, an encounter we'd both, I think, been quietly avoiding since the day the cruiser pulled into my driveway. He was noticeably more subdued than his usual clipped, faintly superior tone, and after a long, awkward pause, he said something I genuinely hadn't expected. "I heard the officer knew you," he said. "From the soccer thing." "He did," I said. "His son's on my team." Gerald nodded slowly, looking somewhere just past my shoulder rather than directly at me. "I wasn't trying to cause you real trouble," he said, in a tone that landed somewhere between an apology and a justification. "I just thought, the noise, the trucks, it felt like it was getting out of hand, and I didn't know how else to get it addressed." I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that a direct conversation, or even a formal complaint through the city's actual permit review process rather than a police call implying illegal activity, would have been a far more reasonable first step than what he'd chosen. I told him, too, that I understood living next to an active small business wasn't necessarily what he'd pictured when he moved in, and that I was genuinely willing to talk through reasonable accommodations if specific things were actually bothering him. Gerald didn't offer much more in response, beyond a quiet, somewhat stiff acknowledgement that he'd think about it. I don't know whether the city's review of his own shed had anything to do with the noticeably different tone he took that day, or whether it was simply the accumulated weight of 2 years of tension finally settling into something closer to reluctant civility. I didn't ask. I don't want to describe what happened over the following months as some dramatic transformation in my relationship with Gerald, because it wasn't. We remain, at best, cordial neighbors rather than friends, exchanging brief, polite greetings when our paths cross and little more than that. But the specific pattern of complaints stopped entirely. No more comments about Theo's truck, no more pointed remarks about the sound of my table saw, no more disputed property lines resurrected out of nowhere. Officer Delgado, for his part, became a small, unexpected fixture of continued goodwill in my life beyond that one visit. He mentioned, a few weeks later at a Saturday game, that he'd told a few colleagues about the coach with the incredible garage workshop, and I ended up, somewhat to my surprise, picking up 2 new custom furniture clients that spring directly through word of mouth traced back to that conversation, a small, unplanned silver lining to what had otherwise been one of the more unsettling afternoons of my year. The following season, Marcus's team ended up winning their division for the first time since I'd started coaching, and Officer Delgado, standing at his usual spot on the sideline for the final game, made a point afterward of thanking me, not for the visit that spring, which neither of us brought up directly that day, but for what he described as 6 years of showing up for a bunch of kids who probably don't say thank you nearly enough. It was a small, ordinary moment, the kind that happens at the end of 100 youth sports seasons every year, but it landed, for me, with a specific weight tied back to everything that had happened months earlier. Theo, who finished up the cabinetry project without further incident, mentioned to me once, toward the end of that summer, that the afternoon with the police cruiser had actually taught him something useful for his own future business, the specific value of documentation, of doing things by the book even when it feels tedious, because you genuinely never know when that diligence will end up maturing in a way you couldn't have predicted. I told him I hoped he'd never need it the way I had, but that I was glad the lesson had landed regardless. People who hear this story sometimes assume I must have known, on some level, that the responding officer would turn out to be connected to me through soccer, that I'd somehow engineered a favorable outcome by building the right kind of community reputation in advance. I didn't, and couldn't have. I coached that team because I genuinely loved doing it, a commitment I made years before Gerald ever moved in next door, with no strategic calculation involved beyond wanting to spend my Saturday mornings doing something meaningful for kids in my community. What I learned, watching that afternoon unfold, is that the kind of quiet, consistent, unglamorous work most people do without any expectation of it ever paying off in a specific, visible way, showing up every Saturday for 6 years, keeping meticulous records nobody but you will ever likely read, staying scrupulously within the lines of a permit even when it would have been easier not to, sometimes does end up mattering, in moments you couldn't have predicted or planned for. Not because you did it strategically. Because you did it consistently, long enough, that when scrutiny finally arrived, there was nothing underneath it to find except exactly what you'd always claimed was there. I don't think Gerald set out to destroy something he understood the full value of. I think, like a lot of people who feel a loss of control over something in their immediate environment, he reached for the most powerful sounding tool available to him, a call to the police, dressed up in language designed to sound alarming, without fully considering what would happen once someone with real authority actually looked closely at the situation he was describing. I still run my business out of that same garage, permit renewed every year without fail, workshop a little busier now than it was before that Thursday afternoon. I don't think about Gerald often anymore, and when I do, it's with less anger than I expected to still be carrying by now, more a kind of quiet, settled clarity about what actually happened and why. What that afternoon taught me, more than anything, is that the truth doesn't always need a dramatic confrontation to be established. Sometimes it just needs someone with the authority to look closely, and enough documentation already in place to make that closer look land exactly where it should. I've since learned to keep building the same way I always have, carefully, consistently, within the lines, not because I expect every difficult neighbor to eventually be humbled by an unrelated soccer coincidence, but because that kind of quiet, boring diligence turned out to be the only thing that actually mattered once someone finally came looking for a problem that wasn't there. If you've ever had someone try to use an institution against you, only to have the truth come out because you'd simply kept doing things the right way all along, I'd love to hear how it happened. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.